The year is 1901 in a small Catalan town called Figueres, Spain. A baby boy is born into the family of a successful notary and his wife. They name the boy Salvador. His parents are, of course, overjoyed. This was a long-awaited child, after all. But their happiness doesn't last long. The boy is constantly sick, and doctors at the time are helpless to do anything about it. By the age of 2, Salvador dies. 9 months later, the same couple welcomes another baby boy, except they decide to give him the exact same name, Salvador. When the second Salvador turns 5, his parents take him to a cemetery and show him a gravestone with the inscription, Salvador Dalí. Just imagine what must be going through this kid's mind right now. They tell him he's the reincarnation of his dead brother. And that's how the life of a legendary artist begins, with a psychological scar. A boy who would grow up to create paintings that for some are terrifying, for others mesmerizing. Paintings unlike anything the world had ever seen. Is that behind those wild eyes and twisted mustache was a shy man who didn't understand much about the world, couldn't manage money, and was terrified of having sex. A man who claimed to hate politics, yet openly declared his love for Hitler and supported the Spanish fascists who murdered his closest friend. Dalí invented his own story and somehow made the whole world believe it. Today, I'm gonna break it down for you. What was real? What was made up? I'll tell you the story of Salvador Dalí, like it all happened yesterday. From the moment he was born, Salvador Dalí was treated like a replacement for his deceased brother. His parents spoiled him, showering him with gifts and giving in to his every whim. But all this affection, it only made things worse. It warped Salvador's character. As he grew up, Dalí became obsessed with proving that he wasn't just a copy. He wanted to stand out, to become one of a kind. So he started throwing tantrums over the smallest things, anything to grab attention. And when he didn't get what he wanted, he'd go full drama queen, threatening to die just like his dead brother. His father was furious. It wasn't just the behavior that got under his skin. He was also angry that his son didn't want to follow in his footsteps. See, Dalí's father was the only notary in all of Figueres. The job brought in some serious money, and naturally he hoped Salvador would carry on the legacy. But Dalí couldn't care less. He hated school, and studying was never his thing. At school, he manipulated his teachers the same way he did his parents. Once during a lesson, he announced he couldn't write and wouldn't be listening at all. And when the teacher walked over to his desk, Dalí flipped the whole thing over and faked a panic attack. He pulled this stunt more than once, needless to say. Still, his mother adored him. She never stopped calling him her special little boy. And Dalí believed her. He believed it so deeply he genuinely thought he was better than everyone else. But that attitude, of course, came with a price. He had no friends. His classmates hated him. They bullied him constantly. Once they even stuffed crickets down the back of his shirt, knowing full well he was terrified of them. Dalí ended up getting into fights at school all the time. The one thing that never bored him, the one thing he truly loved, was drawing. He painted his first real picture at just 6 years old, and that's when his parents finally realized their son had a gift. A talent they had to nurture. That's how Salvador got his own art studio. Right at home, up in the attic. And honestly, he spends almost all of his free time there. His father no longer insisted on him becoming a notary. Quite the opposite. He actually supports Salvador's passion and even hires him a private art tutor, the painter Ramon Pichot. Salvador looks up to him a lot and really listens to him. At just 14 years old, Salvador's work is shown at a local art exhibition for the first time. And on that very same day, he gets into a fight at school with a violinist and smashes the kid's instrument. When asked why he did it, Salvador answered simply, "I wanted to show that painting was better than music." Probably the only place where Salvador could truly relax was the little town of Cadaqués in the Mediterranean coast. Every summer he'd go there with his parents and younger sister for vacation. Salvador loved Cadaqués. The landscapes there inspired dozens of his paintings. But it wasn't just the scenery he was into. Salvador also liked to observe corpses. The sea would often wash up dead fish onto the shore, and once he even found a half-rotten hedgehog and stared at it for ages. It totally mesmerized him. And yeah, all of that, it ended up having a major impact, both on his artwork and his mind. For a while, things in Salvador's life were actually going pretty well. His parents supported his passions, and he started doing better in school as a thank you. But when Salvador turns 16, tragedy strikes. His mother dies of breast cancer. After that, his father marries his late wife's sister. And just like that, the relationship between father and son falls apart. But Salvador doesn't have to stick around for long. He gets accepted into the Fine Arts Academy in Madrid and heads off to conquer the capital. Dalí dives headfirst into student life. The Madrid Academy is where famous artists teach, and talented students flock to learn. Among them, young Salvador is desperate to stand out. He grows his hair long and sports these sideburns, just like in this painting. With the money his father sends, he buys unusual clothes and shows up to lectures in them. His bold look helps Dalí make his first friends: poet Federico Garcia Lorca and filmmaker Luis Buñuel. Together they skip classes, roam Madrid's bars, and dive into discussions about art and literature. Dalí paints their portraits while they have his back when bullies pick on him for his appearance. Dalí and Lorca develop a special connection. Lorca wanted more than friendship, and that scares Dalí. Overall, Salvador was a very shy and introverted kid, but everything changes when he discovers the works of Sigmund Freud. Dalí reads the Austrian psychologist's books and grows more confident. Suddenly, every fear can be traced back to a childhood trauma, his brother's death or his father's strictness. After reading Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, Dalí starts seeing his dreams in a whole new light. He tells his friends that he wants to paint those dreams, but he's just not sure how to yet. Dalí struggles to find his own style and mostly copies others. At this time, he mainly paints his sister, Anna Maria. These portraits catch the eye of his teacher, and he wins several competitions. Dalí's confidence skyrockets, which ends up bringing him into a bit of conflict. In 1923, he leads a student protest against a new teacher. For this, Salvador is temporarily expelled from the academy. But he doesn't seem too worried. His work is already being shown in exhibitions in Madrid and Barcelona. These shows even start bringing in his first earnings. Meanwhile, Dalí's father decides it's time for a change of scenery and sends him to Paris. There, he meets his idol, the famous Spanish artist Pablo Picasso. After some time, Salvador returns to the academy, but the issues with his rebellious streak, they haven't gotten anywhere. In 1921, during an exam, he freezes and he can't answer a question he actually knows well. Without hesitation, Salvador declares, "I won't answer your questions. You couldn't begin to understand, for I am far smarter than all of you combined." After that, Dalí is expelled from the academy, for good this time. He heads back to Paris, where he discovers a new movement in art: Surrealism. Dalí reads about it in the Manifesto of Surrealism. This manifesto is like the new instruction manual for the new movement, written by French poet André Breton. He wrote Surrealism is pure captivity without reason, an automatic expression of the human psyche revealing its true thoughts and emotions. In other words, forget logic. 2 + 2 can equal 5, and that's perfectly fine. Don't think. Paint as if in a trance. Combine the uncombinable. Shock the viewer with what they want to see. Reveal their hidden desires and fears. Dalí loves these ideas. This is exactly how he wanted to paint. Salvador meets the Parisian surrealists and starts creating his first works. This time, Dalí isn't copying anyone. He comes up with his own quote-unquote paranoid critical method. In this method, he mixes Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, André Breton's surrealist ideas, and his own desires to paint dreams. So, how did this method actually work? The artist would deliberately stay awake for a full day or more. Then he'd sit in a chair with a spoon in his hand and start dozing off. The moment he was about to fall asleep, the spoon would drop to the floor, jolting Dalí awake, and he'd immediately start painting whatever he'd seen in that half-dream. By 1929, Salvador had become known, but still just another run-of-the-mill surrealist. To change that, he needed to do something that would truly shock the public. And Dalí decided that paintings alone weren't enough. Together with Luis Buñuel, he created the surrealist film Un Chien Andalou. Every frame was designed to surprise the audience. A razor slicing an eye, a severed hand, a man dragging two pianos with dead donkeys, and two men. One of them happened to be portrayed by Salvador himself. In short, there's no story. The film is more like a nightmare. But that's exactly the point. Dalí and Buñuel wanted to provoke the audience and trigger disgust. Buñuel even filled his pockets with stones to fend off angry viewers after the screenings. But the duo, they loved this film, even though few people could sit through it to the end. The leader of the Surrealists, André Breton, after watching it said, "This is the best Surrealist film I have ever seen." Salvador Dalí gained massive recognition because of it. At 25, Dalí meets a woman who would turn his life upside down. And it happens while he's relaxing with friends in Cadaqués. Poet Paul Éluard joins their group, bringing along his wife, a Russian émigrée, Elena Diakonova. In the French style, everyone just calls her Gala, which means festive. She's 35 years old. Back when she was 18, she moved to Europe to treat tuberculosis. There, she met Éluard, married him, and had a daughter. When Dalí sees Gala for the first time, he falls instantly in love. Salvador decides he's going to try and get to know her better, and attempt to impress her with his original perfumes made from fish glue and goat dung. But then he changes his mind, washes it off, and finally approaches her on the beach looking relatively normal. The group spends whole days relaxing by the sea. Dalí is constantly orbiting around Gala, catering to her whims and laughing the loudest at her jokes. And that's exactly how young Salvador captures her attention. Her husband, Paul Éluard, doesn't even notice. The couple lived in an open relationship. Éluard would show everyone Gala's nude photos, and she didn't hide the fact that she had a lover, the artist Max Ernst. They even lived together as a trio, and nobody batted an eye. After a while, Salvador completely wins over Gala. Paul Éluard goes back with his daughter, while Gala stays in Cadaqués with Dalí. Her marriage was already falling apart anyway. Éluard had stopped paying attention to her, and honestly, he no longer interested Gala. She had long been looking for a new man, young, ambitious, someone who would adore her and provide for her. Dalí wasn't rich at the time, but Gala saw potential in him. She decided to help Salvador unlock his talent. Meanwhile, Gala continued to have affairs with other men, including her now ex-husband, Paul Éluard, but that never got in the way of her relationship with Dalí. She became his muse and manager. Gala organized exhibitions, negotiated with galleries, and handled all the financial stuff. Dalí could paint beautiful works, but in other areas he was completely helpless. For instance, he might forget an important meeting, or simply didn't know how to, or for how much, to sell his art. He couldn't even manage money or cook for himself. See, before meeting Gala, he'd paint on anything at hand. Torn cardboard, sand on the beach, you name it. Gala pushed him to focus and create only on canvas, just like the great masters. When Dalí's father found out his son was involved with a woman 10 years older, who had even left her child for him, he stopped sending money. He did not support this relationship. His sister also refused to accept it, calling Gala a prostitute. Dalí was offended and cut his family off completely. He also, around that time, started to drift away from his old friends, Lorca and Buñuel. Later, Salvador decided to take things even further and completely break with his father. He wanted to provoke him, and he already had a plan in mind. At his next exhibition, he presented a painting with the words, "Sometimes I enjoy spitting on my mother's portrait." Of course, this was a lie. Dalí loved his mother deeply, but when his father sees it, he was furious and forbade his son from ever returning home. On top of that, he cut Dalí out of his will completely. In response, Dalí sends his father a package with his sperm and a note, "This is all I owe you." And then the artist shaved his head, buried his hair on the beach in Cadaqués, and left Spain. Salvador Dalí and Gala moved to Paris. Now, they don't have much money and live in a small apartment rented for them by Paul Éluard. During this period, Dalí creates his most famous painting, The Persistence of Memory, the calling card of surrealism. Soft, melting clocks in the sun. People saw in the painting a symbol of the fluidity of time, Others thought the artist wanted to depict problems with erectile dysfunction. And Dalí himself, as a true surrealist, said that the painting was inspired by camembert cheese. Salvador begins planning his paintings in detail and working with extreme precision. While working, he used a special magnifying glass, kind of like the ones jewelers used to use. His finest brush had only 3 hairs. Dalí's paintings became unique. You could look at one of his works and see a vase, and then, on closer inspection, realize it was actually a human figure. This happened more than once. One time, Pablo Picasso sent Salvador Dalí a postcard depicting African villagers. It inspired him to create a painting. If you turn it upside down, instead of the villagers, a human face appears. Dalí carefully plans what he wants to paint, yet tells people it's all accidental, because he says the paintings sell better that way. Because of this, Salvador begins to work on his own image, because the more famous the artist, the more expensive his paintings become. Dalí grows his iconic thin mustache, which only grows more prominent over time. Every morning, Salvador styles it with hairspray and pomade. In Paris, he attends various parties and creates scandals, attracting attention. Meanwhile, Gala spends her days finding buyers for his paintings. She was very demanding with them, arguing over every detail in contracts. She began to annoy French collectors so much, she ended up earning the nickname the Shrew. Nevertheless, the paintings gradually sold, and they had enough money to buy an old fisherman's house in Portigat near Cadaqués. There wasn't enough money for renovations, so they needed sponsors. In 1933, Salvador found them. A Dalí fan club, Zodiac, was formed. It included 12 people who financed the artist and, in return, could take any painting they wanted once a month. Dalí constantly repeated that he earned money not for himself, but for Gala. And for her, he was ready to cross the ocean. Soon, Salvador did just that, traveling to the United States for his first American exhibition. Now, for Dalí, it was quite a feat, as he had always feared the sea. Throughout the journey, Salvador drank champagne to calm himself, and when the ship finally arrived in New York, a crowd of journalists greeted him. See, Americans had already heard about him and began bombarding Dalí with questions. Someone called him mad, to which he responded, "The only difference between me and a madman is that I am not mad." Right before his trip to New York, Dalí finishes his painting, Portrait of Gala with 2 lamb chops balancing on her shoulders. Reporters ask him, "What does it mean?" Dalí just shrugs and say, "Why lamb chops? Because I like to eat them. Why on Gala's shoulders? Because I love Gala. I don't see why I couldn't paint them together." The next day, every newspaper is talking about Salvador Dalí. The New York exhibition brings in a ton of money, and Dalí realizes something crucial. In art, you've got to know how to sell yourself, and in that, no one could touch him. Every time he steps out in public, it's a full-on show. Every interview, a provocation. Dalí plays the part of the eccentric genius, and the audience is eating it up. Back in Europe, Salvador returns a star, and that really starts to annoy the other surrealists. André Breton despises him for his love of money. He even gives Dalí a mocking nickname, avide dollar, basically greedy for dollars. In Breton's eyes, a real artist should be poor and hungry. Surrealists at the time supported lofty ideas. They were all about equality and against the rich. But Dalí? He loved the high life, and honestly, he didn't care about the struggles of the poor. What mattered to him were the paintings and the provocations. In the 1930s, Dalí starts to develop a strange fascination for Hitler. He declares, "I literally dreamed of Hitler appearing to me as a woman. I was completely enchanted by Hitler's soft, plump back, so perfectly hugged by his ever-tight uniform." Then in 1934, he paints The Enigma of Wilhelm Tell. In it, Dalí depicts a character who looks strikingly like the Russian communist Vladimir Lenin. These 2 stunts infuriate Breton even more. He sends Dalí a letter demanding that he be honest. Does he support Hitler? Dalí responds that he is not a Hitlerist, and in that letter, Salvador deliberately spells it wrong 5 times. Then he adds that he's not a communist either. Breton insists that Dalí swears that he's not an enemy of the working class, but Salvador simply ignores him. Furious, Breton declares Dalí a fascist. He calls a general meeting to vote on expelling Salvador from the Surrealists. Dalí shows up wearing 10 sweaters and coats and turns the whole meeting into a spectacle. He claims he's sick and felt duty-bound to attend. Throughout, he keeps taking off layers, putting them back on, coughing and interrupting Breton. And when he speaks, he holds a thermometer in his mouth, making it hard for anyone to understand him. At the end, Salvador declares, "I painted Lenin and Hitler because I saw them in a dream. Lenin's enlarged behind is not an insult, it's the result of my deep dedication to surrealism. And if tonight I dream of making love to you, Breton, tomorrow I'll paint us both in the most interesting poses with the tiniest details. The difference between the surrealists and me is this. I am a surrealist." For Breton, it was a total flop. No one voted to expel Dalí. In fact, he had their support. Salvador was riding high. He married Gala, traveled across Europe, and rubbed shoulders with famous people. He even collaborated with Coco Chanel on ballroom gown designs. 2 years later, Dalí was invited to give a lecture at the Surrealist exhibition in London. He showed up in a full diving suit, claiming it was his way of diving into the depths of the human mind. Later, he even appeared on the front cover of Time magazine. But the artist's perfect life wasn't without trouble. Spain was on the brink of civil war. Amidst these tensions, Dalí created soft construction with boiled beans. The painting shows a distorted human figure devouring itself, shaped in a way that mirrors the borders of Spain. When the Civil War finally broke out, Dalí stayed silent, supporting no one. Together with Gala, he left for France to ride out the storm. Around this time, Dalí finally fulfills a lifelong dream. He meets Sigmund Freud. The artist saw Freud as a mentor, and during their meeting, he enthusiastically explains his paranoid critical method and shows him the painting Metamorphosis of Narcissus. Freud, leaning over to a friend, whispers, "What a fanatic! If everyone in Spain is like this, no wonder they ended up in a civil war." But Dalí doesn't skip a beat. He immediately starts sketching Freud's portrait. In the end, Freud comes around and actually grows to like him. Sometime later, the Spanish Civil War comes to an end, and the fascist Francisco Franco wins. His regime executes Dalí's old friend, Federico Garcia Lorca. Dalí doesn't dare return to Spain. He continues to live in France, where Breton works to have him expelled from the Surrealists, but Dalí couldn't care less. By 1939, France itself had become unsafe. World War II breaks out, and Dalí and Gala would escape to the US, but they quickly realized they don't have the money for tickets. Even though Dalí was a successful artist, he and his wife had spent all of their money. No savings whatsoever. Their savior? Pablo Picasso, who buys them the tickets. In America, Dalí has to start over from scratch. Once again, he's just a struggling artist, but this time, the world would know his name. Salvador Dalí kicks off his life in New York with a scandal. The Bonwit Teller store on Fifth Avenue invites him to design a window display. And true to his style, he goes all out. Behind the glass, he places a black satin bathtub surrounded by mannequins with human hair. And on top of it all, Dalí stitches a buffalo head holding a bloodied dove in its mouth. The effect is jaw-dropping. A huge crowd gathers outside, so big it spills out into the street. The store management panics and takes the display down. Dalí is furious. He storms inside, flips the bathtub, smashes the glass window, and comes out onto the street with it. Needless to say, he did get arrested. Dalí goes to trial, but he's acquitted. The judge rules that Dalí has the right to defend his creation. Afterwards, the artist declares, "I want to show America real art. If it's not ready for it, then that's its problem, not mine." Dalí is back on the front pages making headlines. In New York, he works tirelessly, determined to make as much money as possible. He and Gala live in a hotel. They turn their room into a salon hosting influential guests. Dalí paints portraits of wealthy clientele in his signature surrealist style. The paintings sell for tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. During this time, Salvador meets wealthy patrons Reynolds and Eleanor Morse. They end up becoming his sponsors. The couple buys a huge collection of Dalí's works and end up opening their own museum. The Morses help organize exhibitions and, together with Gala, handle Dalí's PR. Thanks to them, Dalí finally becomes truly wealthy. He dives into everything he can. He creates jewelry, designs layouts for fashion magazines and costumes. Collaborating with Italian designer Elsa Schiaparelli, he develops a series of unusual fashion accessories: gloves with fake nails, a hat shaped like a shoe, a sofa in the shape of lips, a skeleton dress, and even a dress adorned with a boiled lobster. Rich Americans and Europeans alike absolutely adore his creations and snap them up at top prices. Dalí even starts working with the legendary Walt Disney. Together they create the animated short Destino. But Dalí's ideas are so radical and surreal that the project is shelved and wouldn't be completed until 2003. Beyond that, Dalí works on set design for Alfred Hitchcock's film Spellbound. He comes up with dreamlike imagery. Enormous floating eyes, scissors slicing through them, and a faceless person falling from above. Yet again, some of Dalí's ideas are never realized. They're just too complex. Around this time, the artist writes his autobiography, The Secret Life of Salvador Dalí, told by himself. The book becomes a bestseller and ends up sparking a bit of a scandal. Dalí mixes real facts from his life with wild fiction. He writes about childhood memories, sexual fantasies, and even how he mistreated animals and children. People call the book disgusting and immoral, but that's exactly what Dalí wanted. Alongside Gala, he's shown the world the image of a bizarre, scandalous, genius artist. Every piece he creates is a masterpiece, and the autobiography only amplifies that image. This is how Dalí markets himself. He wants people talking about him non-stop. He lies to journalists, spouts nonsense in public, and insults acquaintances. But he's never serious. In one interview, Dalí said, "Only fools tell the truth, and since I'm very clever, I never do." Dalí protects his image fiercely and doesn't let anyone ruin it. So when his own sister, Ana Maria, publishes a memoir about their childhood, Dalí is furious. She's shattering the story he spent years crafting. In retaliation, he cuts her out of his will. By this point, he's already the richest artist in the world. Life in the US was comfortable, but Salvador missed Spain. Across America, people were starting to say that Dalí had lost his touch, and honestly, his drive to create was fading. New paintings were becoming rare, so Dalí decided to look for inspiration back home. In 1948, Salvador and his wife returned to Spain, where he visits his father, with whom he's finally reconciled, and settles into his house in Port Lugat. The artist notices his country has changed. Francisco Franco, the fascist dictator, is still in power. Many of his old friends are gone. Pablo Picasso has sworn never to set foot in Spain while Franco lives. Luis Buñuel is abroad and Lorca is dead. But Dalí doesn't care anymore. He just wants to be home, no matter who's in charge. The artist even decides to support the fascists. He calls Franco a saint and Spain's savior. They meet, the dictator awards Dalí an honorary medal, and Dalí gifts him several paintings. In 1951, Dalí gives a speech in Madrid and even invites Picasso back to Spain. He says, "Picasso is Spanish, and so am I. Picasso is a genius, and so am I. Picasso is a communist, and I am not." Picasso ignores the invitation, of course. Back in Spain, Dalí suddenly becomes deeply religious. He starts painting classic religious scenes and even meets the Pope. The nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in '45 change him even more. Dalí enters what is now called his nuclear mysticism period, blending religion with quantum physics. He paints the splitting of the atom, showing a nuclear reaction, and Madonna of the Particles, where Virgin Mary is fragmented as if hit by an atomic blast. But the most famous painting from this period is Atomic Leda, depicting the Greek goddess Leda modeled after Gala. Around this time, Dalí's father passes away. Even though he didn't always understand his son's work, he'd always been proud of Dalí's success. After this, Dalí reflects on his childhood and paints Portrait of My Dead Brother. He says it's both a portrait and a symbol of death, which terrifies him. This makes him take his health seriously. Dalí barely drinks and has no interest in drugs. Journalists often would claim that he painted under the influence, but Dalí insisted, "I don't do drugs. I am the drug." And yet, Dalí absolutely loves parties. At these events, he's the real star. Everyone waits to see what crazy outfit he'll wear next. Will he show up with a loaf of bread on his head again? Or maybe he'll bring an anteater or his pet ocelot, Babu. Dalí kept painting for the ultra-rich, and now each artwork could earn him up to $500,000. And honestly, Salvador wasn't even trying anymore. He knew exactly what the wealthy collectors wanted, and it wasn't about the art itself. These people were willing to pay a fortune just to have his signature on the canvas. It didn't matter what he painted, they just wanted that Dalí. So he often rushed through commissions, put his name on them, and sold them for a crazy amount of money. People weren't just buying a painting, they were buying a piece of the legend, a piece of the mad genius that was Salvador Dalí. Later on, Dalí took it even further. He started selling blank sheets of paper with just his autograph on them. Each signature sold for about $40. At one point, he calculated that he could sign 1,800 of those in an hour. That's $72,000 an hour just for signing his name. And whipping up a quick drawing? That was no big deal for Salvador. In 1969, his friend, entrepreneur Enrique Bernat, asked him to design a logo for his business. Dalí agreed, and within an hour he came up with one of the most iconic logos in the world, the Chupa Chups logo. The design has barely changed since. Dalí also had zero shame when it came to doing commercials. He'd advertise anything: cars, candy, even hangover cures. But his most famous ad? "I'm crazy about Lanvin chocolate." That was his only line. Dalí later claimed they paid him in chocolate, the same amount as his body weight. But in reality, he got chocolate and a $10,000 check.
Je suis fou du chocolat Lanvin.
His wealth kept growing, but he didn't really keep track. All he needed was to know the money was there. Managers and Gala handled all the finances. Dalí himself, totally clueless about money. One time, he needed to get from one hotel to the other by taxi. Gala gave him a $100 bill for the ride. A little later, he called her in a panic, said he had no money to get back. Turns out he just handed the driver the whole $100 and walked away. Never even waited for change. The actual fare came out to just about $1. Salvador Dalí has it all. Fame, recognition, and millions in the bank. He's living like royalty. But the fast-paced, extravagant lifestyle starts wearing Gala down. Their relationship begins to fall apart. Dalí still wants to party. He loves being the center of attention, hanging out with celebrities, giving interviews, soaking up the spotlight. But Gala, she's now 70, and all she wants is peace and quiet. So, Dalí gives her a gift: the castle of Pubol in Catalonia. She moves in and sets one strict rule: Salvador can only visit if he has her written permission. And there's more to it. Gala hasn't lost interest in other lovers. One of them is Jeff Fenholt, actor and singer famous at the time for playing Jesus in Jesus Christ Superstar. Jeff even moves into her castle. Gala showers him with gifts, buys him designer clothes, takes him on vacations, all paid for by Dalí. And he doesn't seem to mind. In fact, Dalí believes it helps Gala feel young again. Meanwhile, Salvador isn't exactly alone either. Enter Amanda Lear, a 26-year-old singer and fashion model. They're seen together at exhibitions, parties, and she often stays over at his place in Port Ligat, but not as a lover, as a friend. Dalí is terrified of sex. It never interested him. What he needs is a muse, and Amanda becomes that muse, replacing Gala in his creative life. Surprisingly, Gala likes her too. Amanda does everything Gala no longer wants to do, like going everywhere with Salvador. Around this time, Dalí is pouring his energy into the project of a lifetime, his very own museum. He opens it in 1974 in his hometown of Figueres. But this wasn't just some art gallery. It was a full-blown surrealist universe filled with wild installations, bizarre sculpture, strange furniture, basically everything Dalí had ever dreamed up in his life. Yet, surprisingly, the museum didn't get that much media buzz, because Dalí is making headlines for something else entirely. In 1975, Spanish dictator Francisco Franco is gravely ill. Everyone knows the regime is on its last legs, and as one final act of brutality, Franco has 5 anti-regime activists executed. He labels them terrorists. Europe is outraged. Leaders across the continent condemn him. But not Dalí. He defends Franco, calling him a wonderful man. And for the so-called terrorists, Dalí says they should be eliminated like rats. He even adds that if he had the power, he'd execute 3 times as many people. And just to top it off, he ends the interview with, "I'm against freedom. Freedom is complete garbage." Yeah, people didn't take that one too well. Soon, Dalí starts receiving death threats. Angry protesters throw rocks at his house. Eventually, he decides to leave Spain for a while and heads back to the United States. But in the US, another scandal was waiting for him, this time over unpaid taxes. For years, Dalí's official representative, Peter Moore, had been keeping extremely shady accounts. He took full advantage of the fact that Dalí didn't manage his own finances, secretly selling his artworks and even the rights to them all behind his back. Eventually, Moore was replaced by Robert Duchesne, who went even further. He somehow convinced Dalí to sign over partial rights to his work. Because of these shady deals and his mounting tax issues, Dalí ends up losing millions of dollars. All of this took a serious toll on the artist's health. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. His hands began to tremble. He started losing control over his body and even his voice. And his paintings, they became noticeably simpler. Dalí, who had always loved being the center of attention, now avoided the public eye. He didn't want the world to see him so frail. The saddest part, Gala didn't understand his illness. She kept pushing him to create new works despite his condition. This caused a major fallout between Gala and Amanda Lear, who had stepped in to defend Salvador. In 1982, Gala passed away, and that was the final blow for Dalí. The woman who had been his rock for 50 years was gone. Without her, we likely never would have seen the genius of Salvador Dalí, and he knew that too. Gala convinced me I wasn't mediocre. She always called me a gifted man, and I never believed myself. After her death, Dalí fell into a deep depression. He moved into the Poubelle Castle, a place he once gifted to Gala, and where she was now buried. There, he refused to eat and didn't even want to see his closest friends. The world was slowly starting to forget about the artist. But he would make headlines again, and this time, not because of something he said. In 1984, a fire broke out in his castle. The flames reached the artist's bedroom. Dalí was rescued just in time. No one knew exactly how the fire started, though some speculated it might have been a suicide attempt. Dalí suffered burns, and his iconic mustache, the symbol of his image, was completely destroyed. After that, Dalí moved to live in his museum in Figueres. A special room was prepared just for him. He lived surrounded by his works, always anxious, wondering if people were still interested in visiting his museum. On January 23, 1989, at the age of 84, Salvador Dalí passed away from heart failure. At Dalí's funeral in Figueres, thousands of people show up. Everyone wants to say goodbye to the legendary artist. Dalí's body is embalmed and laid to rest in the floors of one of the museum's galleries. This choice surprises a lot of people. After all, Dalí himself had always said he wanted to be buried at the castle of Poubelle next to his wife. He mentioned it publicly many times and even built a crypt there with 2 graves just for that purpose. But just 2 weeks before his death, the mayor of Figueres, Maria Lorca, announces that Dalí changed his mind. He wants to be buried in his own museum. Apparently, Dalí told the mayor this personally. Everyone is shocked. At that point, the elderly artist could barely speak, and everyone had heard him say many times where he wanted to be buried. Nobody believed the mayor, except for 2 people. Anthony Pichot, the museum's director, and Robert Duchesne, Dalí's secretary. And these 2, they had the authority to make the final call, and both sided with the mayor's version. So, Dalí was not buried next to his wife. He was instead buried in Figueres. And the biggest winners from this decision? The trio themselves. Because having Dalí buried in the museum made it even more popular and, of course, more profitable. Today, Dalí's museum draws 1 million tourists every year from all over the world. Most of them completely unaware that this very spot is where he's actually buried. But in Spain, opinions about Dalí are mixed. Some call him a genius, others despise him because of his connections to Francisco Franco. Yet that connection was probably never heartfelt. See, Franco got the backing of a world-famous artist, and Dalí got protections from persecution in his homeland and the freedom to create. And that's what he valued above all. Freedom. Now, don't get me wrong. Dalí also valued his wealth, and even after his death, it continued to attract people. In 2007, Dalí made headlines again. A Spanish woman, Maria Pilar Martinez, claimed she was Dalí's illegitimate daughter. Allegedly, many years ago, Dalí visited a friend's house in Cadaqués where her mother worked as a maid. A romance supposedly blossomed between her mother and Dalí, and later she gave birth to Maria Pilar. From childhood, Maria Pilar knew Dalí was her father, but she kept it quiet, not wanting to upset her non-biological father, who had no idea. But the story raised a lot of eyebrows. Dalí constantly claimed he was infertile, and Gala, she was the only woman he ever slept with. After all those years together, they never had children. But Pilar demanded a DNA test. They used hair from Dalí's posthumous mask. The result confirmed that Salvador was not Maria's father. Still, she refused to accept it and insisted the artist's grave be opened, a DNA sample taken directly from the remains, and the test repeated. Maria Pilar fought for this for 10 years, and in June 2017, a Madrid court allowed Dalí's remains to be exhumed. On July 20th, the coffin was opened. If paternity had been confirmed, Pilar would have gained the right to the Dalí name and a share of the estate. Dalí had left all of his property, his paintings, and savings to Spain, which today totals around 1.2 billion euro, or 1.4 billion USD. The DNA test was done a second time, and again, it confirmed that Dalí was not Maria's father. Because of her false claims, the court fined her. Interestingly enough, when Dalí's body was exhumed, they discovered that the embalming had been perfectly preserved. His body was in pristine condition, and the legendary mustache, which had regrown after the fire, was still curled upwards, just as famously. Thank you so much for watching. Please support the channel with a like and a subscribe. There's lots of fascinating stuff here. And don't forget to comment below on who you want us to cover in future videos. See you soon.